The orphan, whose name is Clara, stood in front of the towering glass building. The wind was cool against her skin as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. She had only ever imagined this moment in her dreams. To think that today she would be walking into the offices of one of the city's most powerful CEOs. She had no choice but to smile, though there was a knot in her stomach. It felt almost surreal, as if this could all fall apart at any moment. Clara adjusted her blazer nervously and took a step forward, her heels clicking against the marble floors. The city outside was bustling, but inside, it was a different world, quiet, polished, and intimidating. She was just another face in the sea of employees. But to him, she would be more than that. She had made sure of it. As she entered the building, she passed the front desk, where a woman greeted her with a polite nod. "You must be Clara," she said. Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped inside. As the elevator ascended, she glanced at her reflection in the mirrored walls. The woman she saw was determined, but behind her eyes, there was a trace of fear. This would be the first day of the rest of her life. Clara stepped out of the elevator, the nerves she had been suppressing bubbling to the surface. The floors above held an air of power, and now, standing in front of the CEO's office, she could feel the weight of it. The polished mahogany doors in front of her almost seemed like a barrier between the life she had known and the one she hoped to build. She straightened her posture, took a deep breath, and knocked. The sound echoed faintly down the corridor, and soon a deep, commanding voice called, "Enter!" The door swung open slowly, and Clara found herself facing the imposing figure of CEO Richard Lawson. He was standing by the window, gazing out over the city. His back was to her, and for a moment, Clara hesitated, wondering if this was all a mistake. But then he turned. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and the intensity of his gaze took her by surprise. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice smooth yet firm. "I'm glad you made it." His words were simple, but his tone carried weight. Clara couldn't help but feel like a small fish in an ocean, trying not to be swallowed by the vastness of it all. Clara entered the office, the door closing quietly behind her. The room was expansive, with high ceilings and large windows that overlooked the bustling city below. Richard Lawson, the CEO, stood near a massive wooden desk, his eyes still locked on her. His presence was commanding, yet there was a calm authority to him that she couldn't quite place. He gestured toward a chair, inviting her to sit. Clara moved slowly, taking in the sharp lines of his office, the minimalistic design, the immaculate decor. As she sat, Richard remained standing, his gaze shifting from her face to the stack of papers in front of him. "I've been reading about you," he began, his tone casual but deliberate. "You have quite a background, Clara. Impressive for someone your age." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to have looked into her past so thoroughly. The tension in the room grew, and Clara felt the weight of the moment. She couldn't let him know the real reason she was there. She had to play it cool. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm eager to get started." As Clara sat in silence, trying to maintain her composure, Richard walked slowly to the window, his back turned to her. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the city far below. After a moment, he spoke again. "I know your history isn't exactly public knowledge," he said, his voice softer this time. "But I've read enough to know you've been through a lot." Clara's stomach churned. She wasn't sure how much he really knew, but she had to stay in control. "I've learned how to adapt," she replied, forcing a smile. "I've had to." She could feel her pulse quicken as Richard turned back toward her, his gaze intense. There was something about him that made it hard to stay composed. He smiled slightly, his eyes studying her with an almost predatory curiosity. "Good," he said. "I like someone who can adapt. We all have our secrets. Some we keep to ourselves, and others, well, they have a way of coming to light." Clara's heart raced. Was this a threat? Or was he just trying to understand her? She couldn't tell, but she wasn't about to let her guard down. Clara stood to leave, her mind spinning with the conversation. She had to get out of there. Every word Richard said seemed to be a calculated move, a game she wasn't sure she was ready to play. She hadn't even spoken about her real reason for being there. As she moved toward the door, Richard called out to her. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying a different tone now, one that seemed to soften, just for a moment. "I expect great things from you. Don't disappoint me." Clara paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She turned to face him, forcing a calm expression onto her face. "I won't," she said before exiting. As the door clicked shut behind her, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The hallway outside was empty, the soft hum of the building's air conditioning the only sound. Clara stood still for a moment, taking it all in. She had made it this far. Now the real challenge began. The next few days, at the office, were a blur for Clara. The work was challenging, and the pressure immense. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time she passed Richard in the hallways, she caught him watching her, his gaze more intense than usual. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something else. Something deeper. One evening, while reviewing reports in her small office, Clara noticed a folder left on her desk. It wasn't hers. The name on the folder made her heart skip a beat. Lawson. Her mind raced, but she quickly pushed the thoughts aside. This wasn't the time for distractions. She glanced at the clock. It was late. The building was nearly empty, save for the janitor cleaning the hallways. She opened the folder, only to find details that sent chills down her spine. There were references to her family, her real family, the one she had been trying so hard to forget. Clara swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she traced the paper, realizing that Richard had been digging into her past. The walls were closing in. It was only a matter of time before the truth would be exposed. The following morning, Clara found herself distracted, unable to focus on the tasks at hand. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the folder. She knew Richard had to be involved somehow. But why? Why would he be interested in her family? Clara tried to convince herself that she was just overthinking things, but deep down, she knew the answers were buried somewhere in that folder. As she walked into the elevator, her mind was racing. The doors opened to reveal Richard standing inside. His eyes immediately found hers, and for a split second, the world outside the elevator seemed to disappear. He was silent for a moment, his gaze lingering before he finally spoke. "I trust you're settling in well, Clara," he asked, his tone casual, but there was an underlying edge to his words. "I've been following your work. Impressive." Clara's heart skipped, and she forced a smile, nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson." She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. The elevator ride felt unnaturally long, the silence between them thickening with each passing second. That evening, Clara returned home, unable to escape the feeling of being watched. Her apartment was small, tucked away in a quiet part of the city, but it felt empty, like a cage. She sat by the window, staring out at the city, trying to make sense of everything. The cold, dark night mirrored the unease in her chest. She thought about Richard's words in the elevator. "I trust you're settling in well." Why did he say that? And why did it sound so much like a warning? Clara felt a surge of frustration and fear. What was she really dealing with here? Was Richard a man who saw only the business side of her, or was there something more? Her phone rang, cutting through her thoughts. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Hello?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end was low and gravelly. "Clara," it said, sending a shiver down her spine. "You're closer to the truth than you think." And then, the line went dead. Clara stared at the phone in disbelief, her pulse quickening. Who was that? And what did they know? The next day, Clara arrived at the office with a new resolve. She couldn't keep avoiding the truth. The mystery was suffocating her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Richard would push her to confront it. As she walked through the lobby, she spotted a familiar face, a man she hadn't seen in years. It was Greg, an old associate of her family. He was standing by the front desk, talking to the receptionist in hushed tones. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Greg had been a part of the family's inner circle before everything had fallen apart. He had disappeared after her father's death, and she hadn't heard from him since. Why was he here? And why now? Clara approached cautiously, but Greg noticed her immediately. His eyes widened for a brief moment before he quickly composed himself. Clara, he said, his voice low. It's been a long time. We need to talk. Clara's mind raced as she tried to piece together the connection between him and Richard. What did Greg know? And why was he involved in all of this? Clara and Greg sat in a quiet conference room, the door closed between them and the outside world. The room felt suffocating, and Clara's pulse quickened. Greg's demeanor had shifted from the familiar warmth of their past to something more guarded. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You don't know what you're walking into, Clara, he said, his eyes darting around as if to make sure they weren't being overheard. Richard Lawson is more than just a businessman. He's connected to things that go deeper than you could ever imagine. Clara's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. This was the moment she had feared. What things? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg hesitated, looking over his shoulder once more. Your family's downfall wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't even business. It was orchestrated. And Richard, he's the key. Clara's mind spun. Richard, the CEO she worked for. He was the one who had been pulling the strings all along. The revelation hit her like a slap. She had been walking into a web of lies, and now she was caught in the center of it. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that everything around her was starting to unravel. Greg's words echoed in her mind. Richard Lawson is the key. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how deep the web went. That night, Clara stayed up late, going through every document she had access to, trying to piece together the pieces of the puzzle. What Greg had said kept coming back to her. Your family's downfall wasn't just bad luck. It was orchestrated. Richard's name kept appearing in the financial reports, in the connections she hadn't noticed before. She had thought he was just a businessman, someone whose world was far removed from hers. But now, she was starting to see that he was at the center of it all. Clara couldn't remain passive anymore. She had to confront him, to understand his involvement in her family's tragic fall from grace. The next morning she dressed with purpose, her steps determined as she entered the office. She would not leave until she had answers. Clara couldn't believe what she was reading. The more she dug into the records, the clearer it became that Richard had played a significant role in her family's downfall. She traced the financial transactions back to a secret offshore account, one that was linked to Richard's business empire. The same account that had siphoned off the funds her father had worked so hard to build. Clara's hands trembled as she sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. Why did he do this? Was he responsible for my father's death? Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Greg. Meet me at the old warehouse tonight. You need to know the full story. Clara's heart sank. This was it. The moment of truth. She had to confront Richard, and she had to do it now. Clara arrived at the old warehouse, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the abandoned building. The city felt miles away here, as if this place existed in its own isolated world. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she made her way inside. The door creaked open, revealing Greg standing in the shadows. He motioned for her to come closer. You're here, he said softly, his face serious. This is bigger than you think, Clara. Richard didn't just ruin your family, he's been pulling strings in the city for years. He handed her a folder filled with photos and documents. Clara's breath caught as she flipped through them. There were images of Richard meeting with shady individuals, of large sums of money changing hands, and of secret meetings in hidden locations. He's been orchestrating everything, Greg continued. And now you're in the middle of it. Clara's mind was reeling. She had always believed in justice, but now she was staring at the consequences of betrayal. Clara sat in the dim light of the warehouse, the weight of Greg's words hanging heavily in the air. She had come here for answers, but now she wasn't sure if she could handle the truth. Richard had been playing a dangerous game, and she had unwittingly become his pawn. As she examined the documents, Clara's eyes locked onto one photograph, a picture of her father shaking hands with Richard. The smile on her father's face was a lie, a facade covering the betrayal that was brewing beneath the surface. Richard had been involved in every step of the downfall, using her family's business as a stepping stone to build his own empire. The anger inside Clara began to bubble to the surface. She had trusted Richard, had believed in him. But now, she realized, she had been nothing more than a tool to him. Her fists clenched, and her heart raced. It was time for confrontation. Clara stormed into the office the next morning, her resolve stronger than ever. She had all the evidence she needed. Richard couldn't deny it anymore. She barged into his office without knocking, her eyes blazing with determination. Richard looked up from his desk, his usual calm demeanor faltering for just a moment. "Clara," he said, standing slowly. "What's this about?" Clara slammed the folder of documents onto his desk. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her voice steady but filled with fury. "You've been manipulating my family, destroying everything we built. And you've been using me to cover it up." Richard's expression changed. His cool exterior was replaced by a flicker of surprise, then something darker, more calculating. "Clara," he said softly, "you don't understand the bigger picture." But Clara wasn't listening anymore. "I understand perfectly," she replied. "And now it's over." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard standing in stunned silence. Clara's heart was racing as she walked out of Richard's office. The confrontation had gone differently than she had expected. Richard hadn't tried to deny the allegations, but he hadn't fully confessed either. Instead, he'd remained calm, almost too calm, as if he had anticipated this moment. Clara had expected a fight, a defense, but all he had offered was silence. "You don't understand the bigger picture," he had said. But now, Clara was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She couldn't just walk away, not after everything she had learned. But as she stood at the elevator, her mind swirling with anger and confusion, she realized something. The more she fought for answers, the more she was falling into Richard's game. Was she doing the right thing? Was she becoming the very thing she despised? As the elevator doors closed behind her, Clara felt the weight of her decision. She could expose Richard, destroy everything he had built, or she could walk away and protect herself. But could she live with herself if she chose the latter? Clara spent the rest of the day in a haze, her mind wrestling with the choices she had before her. Richard's words kept haunting her. "You don't understand the bigger picture." What did he mean? What was this bigger picture he was referring to? As she sat in her office, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Greg. He entered, his face grim. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. She motioned for him to sit, but her mind was elsewhere. Greg had always been a part of her life, a reminder of the past, but now he seemed like another player in a game she couldn't fully understand. "I spoke to some people," Greg continued. "Richard isn't the only one involved in this. There's more at play here. If you go after him, you'll be exposing more than just your family's fall. You'll be digging into the city's most powerful people." Clara's heart sank. Was this a warning or a threat? "I don't care about the power games, Greg. I care about the truth," Clara said, her voice steady. "And I'm not backing down now." Clara knew Greg was right. Going after Richard would mean exposing the truth about her family. But it would also tear apart the lives of many powerful people in the city. People who wouldn't hesitate to destroy her if she got too close. But Clara had already come too far. She couldn't walk away now. She had spent her entire life seeking the truth. And now that she was finally on the verge of uncovering it, she couldn't stop. But the fear was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. Was she making a mistake? That evening, she made her decision. She would confront Richard again, but this time she wouldn't just ask questions, she would demand answers. No more games. No more silence. She knew the risks, but she was ready to face them. She had to. As she left her apartment to meet Richard, Clara's mind was clear. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. Clara arrived at Richard's office, the same towering building that had felt like a prison just days before. This time, though, she didn't feel the weight of uncertainty. She was ready. As she walked through the lobby, the receptionist greeted her, but Clara didn't stop. She was determined now, her steps purposeful and quick. When she reached Richard's office, she didn't wait for permission. She knocked once and entered, her eyes locking with his immediately. Richard was sitting at his desk, looking calm as ever, but Clara could see the flicker of wariness in his eyes. "Clara," he said, his voice cool but not unkind. "What is this about?" Clara didn't sit down. She stood across from him, her body tense. "I'm not leaving until you tell me everything," she said, her voice steady. "The truth about my family, about the money, about the power you've been hiding." Richard's expression hardened, and Clara could feel the tension rise. "You don't know what you're asking for," he replied. "You might not like the truth." But Clara wasn't going to back down. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked toward the window, his back to Clara. For a moment, it seemed like he might ignore her request, but then he turned, his face somber. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said quietly. "But you're right. It's time you knew the truth." Clara's heart pounded as she listened. Richard sighed, walking over to a locked drawer in his desk and pulling out a folder. He handed it to her wordlessly. Clara opened it, revealing photographs and documents. It was all there, the financial records, the secret deals, the shady connections. The evidence she had been searching for. "Your father's downfall wasn't just a business decision," Richard continued, his voice low. "It was orchestrated, and I was part of it. But it wasn't for power, Clara. It was for survival." Clara's mind reeled. She had never imagined the truth could be so tangled, so complex. Richard had been involved, but so had others. The game was bigger than she had thought. Clara sat in her apartment, the folder Richard had given her spread out before her. The photographs, the documents, the connections, it was all coming together, and it was worse than she could have imagined. The people involved in her family's fall from grace weren't just businessmen. They were part of a much larger web of corruption that spanned across the city. As Clara traced the names and dates on the pages, a cold realization settled in. She wasn't just a victim of bad luck. She had been deliberately targeted. Richard had been a player in this game, but so were others, powerful figures with connections deep in the political and financial systems. Clara felt both numb and furious. She knew what she had to do next, but the question remained. Could she do it alone? Her phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Greg. His voice was tense as soon as she answered. "Clara, we need to meet. It's time to act. Richard won't back down, but we can still take him down." Clara met Greg at the old warehouse once again. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of finality in the air. Clara could feel the weight of the decisions she was about to make. Greg handed her a small envelope, and as she opened it, she found a list of names and addresses. "These are the people who are involved," Greg said, his voice low and urgent. "Richard might be the mastermind, but there are others who need to be exposed." Clara looked at the list, her fingers trembling slightly. She knew what this meant. Exposing these people would send shockwaves through the city. It was more than just taking down Richard. It was about bringing down the entire corrupt system that had allowed her family's destruction. "Are you ready for this?" Greg asked. Clara didn't hesitate. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady. "This ends now." The following days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategy. Clara and Greg worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, reaching out to contacts, and preparing for the inevitable fallout. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. It was time to confront the people who had been pulling the strings behind her family's downfall. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Clara felt the weight of her choices. She knew there was no going back now. As she stood outside the building where the corrupt figures were meeting, Clara felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She was no longer the victim. She was the one taking control. With Greg by her side, Clara walked into the building with purpose. She was ready to expose everything. Inside the building, the confrontation was tense. Clara, Greg, and a few of their allies faced off with the powerful figures who had been involved in her family's ruin. The room was large, with dark wood paneling and antique furniture, but it felt sterile, as if the power in the room had drained all warmth from the space. Richard stood at the front, his back straight, his expression cold. The others were seated around a large conference table, their faces a mix of disdain and fear. Clara took a deep breath and spoke, her voice cutting through the silence. "This ends today," she said, her words sharp and resolute. "The truth is out. It's time to face the consequences." Richard's gaze flickered, but he remained silent. The others, however, shifted uncomfortably. Clara's eyes scanned the room. She had come here for answers, but more importantly, she had come for justice. The stakes were high, and Clara knew that this was her one chance. The confrontation was intense, but Clara's determination never wavered. As the truth came pouring out, alibis, forged documents, and secret meetings, Richard and the others had no choice but to admit their involvement. The room was filled with a mix of disbelief and anger, but Clara held her ground. She wasn't here for apologies or excuses. She was here to take down the system that had destroyed her family. By the end of the meeting, Richard and the others were on the verge of collapse, their power shattered by the revelations. Clara knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of justice. As the group filed out of the room, Richard turned to her one last time. "You've won for now," he said, his voice cold. "But don't think this is over." Clara didn't respond. She had already won. The city buzzed with the news of Richard's downfall. Clara sat at her apartment, watching the television with mixed emotions. Richard's empire crumbled under the weight of her efforts, but the victory felt hollow. Her father's legacy was ruined, and the people who had helped her now faced threats of retaliation. Yet Clara knew she had done the right thing. Her fight for justice had cost her dearly, but she felt a strange sense of liberation. She had exposed the truth and held the powerful accountable. But as the news unfolded, Clara realized the battle was only just beginning. The city was waking up, and so was she. Clara walked through the busy streets, her thoughts heavy. The world had shifted, and she had become someone new, a woman who had uncovered the truth and exposed the city's hidden corruption. But despite the victory, guilt gnawed at her. Her father's name was tarnished forever, and she couldn't shake the feeling of loss. She paused outside the courthouse, staring at the building that held her past. Redemption wasn't about undoing the damage, it was about accepting it and moving forward. Clara made her peace in that moment, realizing that the past would always be a part of her, but it wouldn't define her future. Later that day, Clara met Greg at a small cafe. He slid a folder across the table, filled with more names, more connections. "The city's waking up," Greg said, his voice urgent. "But there's still work to do." Clara looked at the list, her fingers tracing the names. They had exposed some, but there were more out there, hidden in the shadows. Greg was right. The battle wasn't over. But for now, Clara had to take a breath. She had fought for justice, but the road ahead would be long. "One step at a time," Clara replied, closing the folder. "For now, I'm just going to rest." Clara stood on the rooftop of her building, looking out at the city below. The skyline stretched before her, a beautiful yet scarred reflection of everything she had been through. The wind tugged at her hair, and Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her choices. The fight had been brutal, but it had made her stronger. She had found her voice, and now she could stand on her own. This was her redemption, not just for her family, but for herself. Clara smiled softly as she looked toward the horizon. Whatever came next, she was ready. The next morning, Clara stepped back into the bustling streets of the city. The chaos of the world around her seemed distant now. She had made her peace, and the weight of the past no longer dragged her down. As she walked, Clara realized that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey. The truth had set her free, but there would be more challenges ahead. Clara was ready to face them one step at a time. She had taken control of her life and her future. Nothing would stand in her way. Clara stood on the edge of the city, staring out at the skyline. Everything had changed. Richard was behind bars, the corruption exposed. But Clara knew the battle wasn't over. There were still hidden players, shadows she hadn't yet uncovered. It was time to face the final piece of the puzzle, the last person responsible. Her heart raced as she thought of the choices ahead: destroy everything or bring the truth to light and rebuild. Clara entered the familiar conference room, the tension palpable. The person she had come to confront was seated at the table, waiting. "I know what you've done," Clara said, her voice steady. "It's time to face the truth." The silence between them grew heavy as Clara took a deep breath, waiting for the confession. This was the final step. No more hiding. The truth came pouring out in fragments. Clara's heart raced as the pieces finally fell into place. The person she faced was just a part of the larger scheme. They weren't the mastermind. "It's bigger than you think," the person admitted. Clara's mind spun, but she wasn't finished. She needed to decide how to end this. Would she destroy everything or build something better? Clara made her choice. She would rebuild, not destroy. The system was broken, but it could be fixed, one step at a time. "I'm not tearing it all down," Clara said. "I'm making it right." The person across from her nodded slowly, realizing that Clara's decision was final. She had chosen a path of justice, but not vengeance. It was time to move forward. Clara walked through the city streets, feeling the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The work wasn't done, but Clara knew she was ready. With each step, she moved closer to the future she was determined to build. The city, like her, had been through a transformation, and now she was prepared for whatever came next.